if it's a motto, it's just kind of how I feel. It's because my faith tells me I will see him again. My mind tells me he's forever pain-free. And my heart tells me he's always standing right beside me. And by doing these things, I'm just trying to provide opportunities for people to share their stories so that when somebody like myself who gets in the middle of a diagnosis and doesn't know what to do, they can come and listen to some stories.
This is the Heart of Hospice podcast with Helen Bauer. Today's guest was featured in the 2015 Pulitzer Prize-nominated caregiving story, In Sickness and in Health, A Couple's Final Journey, a documentary that chronicled his experience as a caregiver. Whether you're a family caregiver or an end-of-life professional, the Heart of Hospice is here to enhance your hospice experience by connecting you with information you can use about end-of-life care.
This episode is sponsored by Hospice Navigation Services. When end-of-life care becomes confusing or overwhelming, Hospice Navigation Services can help. Hospice navigators are hospice professionals with at least 10 years of hospice experience, trained to provide accurate, unbiased information. Hospice Navigation Services, the guide for your journey. Now, here's today's episode.
My guest today is Chris MacLellan. He's affectionately known as the bow tie guy, although I have to say he wasn't wearing a bow tie today for his interview. But he's known as the bow tie guy in the vast network of family caregivers. He says wearing a bow tie is like wearing two smiles. Chris and his life partner, Richard, were featured in a Pulitzer Prize-nominated caregiving story called In Sickness and in Health, A Couple's Final Journey. Chris is also the author of What's the Deal with Caregiving, and he's hosted over 300 episodes of his popular podcast, Healing Ties, on the Whole Care Network. And he is also the founder and owner of the Whole Care Network. He is currently the host of a new podcast called Aging Gayfully. He's warm. He's got a wonderful story to tell. There are a lot of life lessons incorporated inside his caregiving experience. So I'm so glad to bring to you my conversation with Chris MacLellan. Chris MacLellan, it is so nice to have you on the podcast. Welcome.
Oh, Helen, it's great to be here with you. I'm excited to have our conversation. Thanks for asking me today.
Well, I'm going to start out with an icebreaker question.
Okay.
Just to get us started. It's off topic, but still good.
Okay.
If you could only have one color of clothing in your closet, what color would that be?
Oh, it's a no-brainer. Purple.
Purple. You know, I think I've asked that question 3 or 4 times, and more than one person has said purple.
Purple is kind of like my color. But the funny thing is, I've tried to find purple glasses, and I can never find a pair of purple glasses that looks right. So, but I've got tons of purple shirts. So yeah, I even have a pair of purple shoes.
A pair of purple shoes.
Yeah.
It's like for royalty. Purple is for royalty.
Well, anything that I say in response to that will probably get me in trouble. So I'll just say, okay.
I love it. Okay. So we're going to jump in. You have had an amazing caregiving experience, and you're doing some amazing work in the caregiving space. So I want to talk with you, if you let me get personal, about your hospice caregiver experience with your life partner, Richard. How did it start out, and how did that experience progress for you?
Well, actually, being a social worker myself and having a unit of CPE, clinical pastoral education, I had some knowledge of hospice, but when you're on the other side as a patient or as a caregiver, it's a little bit of a different experience. You know, Richard had told me early on that when I'm ready for hospice, I'll tell you. And we were fortunate that we had that open of a relationship that we had those conversations. But our first experience with hospice, right after his diagnosis with esophageal cancer, was not what I would say an A+. We ended up firing the first hospice that came in to the home. but I was okay with that because, as the caregiver, being kind of the lead per se of the care team, when he looked at me and says, I don't want this group of people in my house ever again. There are a number of problems with medication. One I remember vividly one day when his ankle swelled up, and I called. It was on a weekend, and the person that was answering the phone, just give him more morphine. I said, oh, wait a minute, he's not even on morphine. So I was okay with firing the hospice because that's what he wanted. But then it came time again for us to go to hospice as the esophagus cancer really took hold of him. And it actually was one of the most beautiful experiences that we could have. Everybody was not only attentive, but I knew that that's what he wanted to do because he had told me. And he hadn't been able to get out of the chair on his own for 3 or 4 days. But when the hospice nurse arrived at the house, and they came in with, the EMS came in with the gurney to take him, he got right out of his chair and walked right to the gurney. It's like, what? And that, it goes back to what he told me before. I'll tell you when I'm ready. And off we went to inpatient hospice with the mindset, we're just going for a couple of days to get the medication regulated, and we're going to come home and do hospice at home. Well, that never happened.
So, Chris, when Richard said, I don't want these people back in my house.
Mm-hmm.
This was a mistake and I don't want to do that. Were you scared about losing that support, or did you feel that there would be repercussions? Did you have any concerns about actually firing the hospice team?
The concern I had, and I think this is a concern that a lot of caregivers have, is, oh my God, I'm going to be all by myself doing this. Because when you're in the midst of caring for somebody, and it's emotional on one side of the coin, but it's also kind of frantic on the other. You're trying to find the help that you need in order to get through the day. But, and I've learned this after the fact. I didn't know this then, but I know it now. And that's why I kind of like to, be on wonderful podcasts like yours to talk about our experiences. I'd rather have no help than insufficient help.
Oh, wow. Say that again. Say it again.
I'd rather have no help than insufficient help.
I really want to highlight that. I've never had a guest that has said they fired a hospice team.
Well, we did.
I think people are so hesitant to do that. They feel that they don't have any other choices, or like you're saying, it's an emotional and a frantic time. They're
right.
grieving, they're overwhelmed. And now this is just another decision and starting over with a brand new group of people. It takes so much energy to do that.
It does. But I think if you're looking at this from just like a pragmatic point of view, this is what Richard wanted. I agreed with this because I was frustrated with them too. When they told me to give him more morphine, I just kind of looked in the phone and said, what?
Right.
I'm not a nurse, but I certainly know that's not what he needs. It was, I knew it was time also. But I think, I'm in my mid 60s. I grew up, Catholic school and authority. They were all knowing, all seeing. You never question authority. But you know what? As a caregiver, you are the CEO, the chief everything officer of that care team, not the doctors.
Right.
And advocacy is a number one role for every caregiver. And did we agree on every decision? No. But that decision, that was it was a no-brainer.
Yeah.
And I wasn't worried about how it would look, or because I was somewhat involved in the social. I was involved in the social work community where we lived, and I was connected. I knew some of the folks on staff at this hospital. I was like, no, you cannot, you cannot be a part of this, or you cannot be a part of our care team the way you've treated us.
Yeah.
And I think, as a caregiver, you say, you don't want to ruffle feathers. You want to make sure the person gets the best care. But the way to get the best care is to be the advocate that the role calls for. And sometimes it's making those tough decisions that you may not be used to doing.
Right. Right. And it's not about being friends. Advocacy is not about making friends and being friends.
Advocacy. It's funny. I had, see, by getting my memory going, I had a very heated discussion with one of the nurses, and there was a physician there, and the nurse finally said, he's just advocating for his friend. And I looked at her and said, exactly, because over the span of, goodness, especially the last 6 months of his life. I mean, we were in and out of the hospital. We were meeting new people, new physicians. And I said, these folks don't know they can read the chart, but they don't really know him. And it's kind of like the one physician who said to me, oh, well, he just needs to go down to the main hospital and have open heart surgery because it's been 10 years since he's had a bypass. That's the only thing that's going on with him. I said, if I had not been there, or if Richard did not have an advocate and that doctor had gone in and talked to him by himself, Richard would have agreed to that.
To having open heart surgery.
Having open heart surgery, because he would have trusted what that doctor was saying.
Right.
And that, it comes back full circle about your caregiver, as a caregiver, your role as an advocate, and knowing, having those open and honest conversations, and stepping up and questioning authority. It's okay.
Yeah.
It's okay. And you'll know right off the bat whether or not they're receptive. If they're not receptive to being questioned or answering questions, then they're probably not somebody you want on your care team.
Oh, I absolutely agree. You hear healthcare people in internal conversations, not in front of patients and families, but they talk about families that are problem people, the people that are constantly asking questions. Is this an option? Could we do this? Do you think this would be effective? And it's some wear and tear on nurses and other healthcare providers, chaplains and social workers, because it takes extra effort and extra time on our part. But what I have always said about patients and families like that is they made me a better practitioner.
Thank goodness.
Oh, yeah. It kept me on my toes. I had to teach. I had to give them everything that they needed, everything that they wanted, and answer questions. Sometimes I had to reach out to other clinicians. Sometimes I had to do research to find out, talk to my doctor, the medical director. But I always thought it made me a better practitioner. So I think it's about mindset, viewing these folks that push for answers and ask you for more, as caregivers and caregiver advocates. Just, it makes us better practitioners at what we do.
I, over the years I've been involved in the caregiving, I call it kind of the caregiving sphere, because it's, there's so many layers to it as it relates to the doctors, nurses, attorneys, social workers, clergy. I mean, you can just kind of go along the line. And I had a doctor tell me, and this kind of goes along with what you're saying, the best patients are the ones that ask the questions.
That's nice.
And, in return, I said, and the best doctors are the ones who listen and answer the questions.
Navigating end-of-life care can be confusing and overwhelming. Hospice Navigation Services can help you navigate hospice care for the best end-of-life experience possible. Hospice navigators are hospice professionals with at least 10 years of hospice experience, trained to provide accurate, unbiased information. Our team's compassion and respect for quality of life allows them to help you focus on getting the kind of care you want. When you need in-depth information about hospice, a Level 1 navigation session can provide information on what hospice care includes, roles of the team members, and how to choose a hospice agency. A Level 2 session is the best choice if you want to include multiple members of your family or caregiving village, and includes an explanation of hospice costs and coverage. If you have specific questions about a current hospice experience, a question and answer session with a hospice navigator can give you the answers you need. Watch for the launch of the Hospice Navigation Services in January 2023. Hospice Navigation Services, the guide for your journey.
So when you think back about the time that Richard was in hospice and you were providing his care, being that lead of his care network, his caregiving team, what do you think hospice got right? What were the best things about the hospice care that you received?
I think oh goodness. I might even start crying here.
That makes some of the best interviews.
Yeah, I think the best part of this, I don't know if I've ever used those two words to get best part about, was something that Richard and I had, the genuine love, care, and commitment that was prevalent from the staff. Because, and I'm kind of talking to the choir here, but it takes a special person to work in hospice. Not everybody can do it. It's kind of like ministry per se. Not everybody can work with kids. Some people like to work with seniors, or they like to work with middle. And I think that's the same for. I think that's the same for people in the healthcare profession that work in hospice. Is you really, there's no middle ground. You either love it or you don't. Even with some of the issues that came up the week that were there, the love, care, and commitment was prevalent throughout the whole experience. And that's something that was missing from hospice number one.
Right.
It was, and so it was, and that's why it's important for people. I would have, it's okay to shop around. It's okay to interview hospices.
Absolutely. Say that again.
It's okay to shop around, and it's okay to interview hospice, and it's okay to ask the interviewing nurse some really difficult questions. Because they're, my God, I'm going to go ahead, because they're all standing at the nursing station looking for clients. So, I mean, that's.
They're not supposed to do that these days, but yes,
Yeah,
everybody's out to get a piece of the same pie. That's absolutely true.
The cold hard facts of it is it's a business. And unfortunately for people who are dealing with it, usually for the first time, or they're in the middle of an emotional, whether, like caregiving happens because of two things, an unfortunate accident and an untimely diagnosis, and suddenly you're thrust in this role. And most people don't have the background or knowledge about the medical system, how it all works. They're making all these emotional decisions. And there's people all kind of around wanting to help them out, but it's kind of like, what analogy can I come up with? It's like if you're shopping on Amazon and you've got 3 or 4 different brands. What's the best brand that fits for you?
Sure.
It's totally okay to have that mindset when talking to hospices. Where do you fit? Is a nonprofit better than a for-profit? There's there's some differences. Most people who are in the middle of trying to make this decision don't have no clue that there's options like that available.
That's true. That's absolutely true. I think that's one of the best lessons of being an advocate as a caregiver is you get to choose.
You get to choose.
Yeah, you get to choose.
That's why I'm so big on story sharing, because and you've probably heard me say this before, but I firmly believe it's through story sharing where diversity meets the road to collaborate on a common cause. And the best information and referral usually comes from one caregiver to another because they've been in the trenches. They understand the journey that other caregiver is going on, even though it could be a little bit different. But we all understand where we've been and where we're going, because there's no strangers when it comes to caregiving. So when I can share my story and it helps one person avoid some of the pitfalls that we had, then, I've kind of done what we're all called to do, help each other out.
Right. There's a common human experience.
Exactly.
Exactly. So when you look back now at the hospice agency and the care that you guys received, what could they have done differently other than the mistakes, right? The technical skill mistakes.
Yeah. Right.
What could they have done differently?
Well, I think it's important to, share a couple of incidents that happened that week in inpatient. Richard and I hadn't spent a day apart in years. Was every day perfect? No. I mean, it's like any other couple. We had our disagreements, but the first night that we got into inpatient hospice, we got all settled and we were fine. We had a wonderful conversation, and he looked at me and he said, "Chris, I want you to go home. You've been up most of the last 3 or 4 nights. I want you to go home. I'll be safe. I'm comfortable. Go home and I'll see you in the morning." Well, we had a little debate about that. And I finally relented. I went home. It was about a 20, 25 minute drive. It wasn't close. It was the only time I'd been away from him for, I can't tell you how long, but what happened was somewhere in the night, he apparently got up. Never really got the full story about it, but they found him laying on the floor in the room. And what, kind of like standing operating procedures, I guess, but they had started the morphine drip after they found him on the floor. And they tried to call. I woke up the next morning and I get to see that they had called a couple of times, and they assured me that he was fine. They kind of said we started the morphine drip, which, took me really right back to, God, I didn't tell them before I left. No morphine, no change in meds until we see the doctor. And when I got there that morning, I mean, he was very peaceful. But he's also wasn't able to communicate with me any longer. So I thought long and hard about that night. If those what ifs, and every caregiver goes through these what ifs. What if I'd have been there, or if I had told them not to give him any morphine, what would have changed? Well, he probably would have lived another 2 weeks in a lot of pain. That was my way of, and it took me a long time to get beyond that, feeling guilty about leaving. Like like my caregiving cape has unlimited powers and I can just change somebody else's destiny.
Right.
I mean, that to me, that was something that if we could have changed it, I would have loved to have changed that. But was never going to change the outcome. It would have prolonged, sure, maybe he would have come home and died at home, which is what he wanted. But even in and around that incident's really not the right word. It was like, oh my God, this is actually happening, because if there was anybody that was in terminal denial about his condition, it was me. I never, because he always gotten better. So it's like, oh, well, he's coming home. Why not?
Sure.
And so much of this is in retrospect because of our story that was in the newspaper and the over 1,000 pictures that they had taken of Richard and I. The newspaper had taken of Richard and I over the 6-7 months they had followed us. And I looked, and when I finally got to see all the pictures after he died, and I said, oh my God, this man was really sick. Because that's the other thing that happens with caregivers is, we're with our care partner, our loved one, whatever term that you're comfortable in using. We're with them every day. And we don't see those subtle changes. And that's why it's so important to pay attention to the care team and, get their feedback and don't take it personally. But when I saw all these pictures of him, it's like, oh my God, he was so jaundiced. It's like, and then that other experience that you're trying to draw out of me, and I'm when I'm standing there with the two doctors at the door in his hospice room. This was probably around day 4 or 5. And I have my copious notes. I'm wanting to know this and that, and the two doctors just looked at me and said, Chris, we don't know how this man has lived as long as he's lived, considering the amount of cancer that's in his body. It's a testament to the love and care that the two of you have had, that he's lived this long. It's like, well, I was a wilted flower the rest of
Of course.
But when you're in the middle of it and those emotions kind of kick in, you don't really, I can't believe I'm going to use this word, but I'm going to, you remove the pragmatic side of what's really transpiring. I mean, he was dying. And I'm thinking we're coming home. I'm thinking we're coming home and having stone crabs. It's like, because that's what especially if somebody is two people that were in soulmates and as love as the two of us were, that's kind of what you wanted. At least that's what I wanted. But I've also learned in the process that night that he sent me home, that was his way of preparing for his transition. I didn't know that then, but I know it now. And I just know that was his way of, over and above them giving him the morphine. And that was his way of preparing, because while we had our life, this was his life. I wasn't taking all the medication. I wasn't going to radiation. I was the co-pilot in this. If I could have gotten that bed for him, I would have. But, you don't recognize that when you're in the midst of the emotional dwither that goes on with the dying process.
Caregivers are on a nasty roller coaster through that whole thing. The ups and downs, but we always come back up.
Always come back up.
Yeah, you always coast along.
Mm-hmm.
I remember telling the spouse of a very, very ill patient, you can't go where she's going. You're not going where she's going. And in the midst of his grief and the emotional burden that comes with losing someone, he knew that. He absolutely knew that. But when you've been, like you're saying, you're there for every appointment, all the radiation treatments, you're going along for everything. You're the information keeper. You're the person who signs, who parks, who gets you in, gets you out, does all the discharge planning and sets up the meds. Then to be disconnected for that last act feels unnatural to a caregiver.
It does, because I like to kind of term this as two relationships in one. That pre-established partnership, marriage, however you want to describe it. Then all of a sudden, this thing called caregiving appears, and it takes relationships to a different level. That love, care, and commitment. I mean, it's true, but when people are either getting married, or now that there's marriage equality, they forget about how intertwined death and marriage is. Because we're not thinking about death when we're getting married, but you know what? Somebody gets sick. One of the who's going to be the caregiver? Can you be a caregiver? Is that something a role that you can do? Can you toilet and shower your spouse, your partner? Not everybody can do that, but I know we're getting real serious. So I'm going to give you a funny story here about toileting, if that's okay.
Sure.
So Richard was very independent. He hated asking for help, but towards the end, he needed help with toileting. And so he'd look at me and I'd look at him, and I knew where we were going. He'd say, well, it's time for a pooperama. So we'd get the walker. Sometimes we had to get the walker. We'd get the wheelchair. We'd go, and he'd be sitting there and he'd be doing his thing. And then I'd be standing at the door. But you know what, Helen? Some of the most meaningful, intimate conversations were had when he was sitting on the pot and I'm standing there. And, we talked about our life together. We talked about things that he wanted at the end of life. We talked about places we wanted to go. So I missed the pooporamas.
I love it. You turned an awkward, or what could have been an awkward, intimate moment into just an intimate moment.
And just it's when you think about it, I don't want to be overtly graphic here, but I mean, we all do it.
Right.
And sometimes, and I've learned here over the last couple of years, when I've had some heart issues, and I've had to be on the other side of care, where I've had to, I've needed help in getting into the shower. I was able to get in touch with some of those things about Richard. Why he didn't take all that wonderful advice I had. Because you end up, let's see if I can articulate this right. When you're needing care, you have to also recognize that there's a part of you that's not working like it once did.
Yeah.
And convincing yourself that you need help is, I was really amazed at when I had the ablation procedure, how much help I needed at in the recovery. It's like, because I didn't like asking for help, because it's, I don't want to bother anybody, or I can do this.
Sure.
Yeah.
I think every caregiver can gain some very, very valuable insight from being the person who needs the care.
I agree 100%. I used to think that I knew a whole lot about caregiving, but until I needed a caregiver, it never really, the emotional impact, I never really got in touch with that until I needed a caregiver.
Yeah. Yeah. I think as especially for healthcare professionals, you look at people and you don't understand why they don't want to accept care. Why are you being so stubborn about this? He's just strong-willed. He's a stubborn old coot. Why doesn't this patient want this? And there's so much depth to a patient wanting to maintain independence and privacy and autonomy. There's so much caught up in that. And I think sometimes as caregivers, whether you're professional or personal, you just want to get the job done. So if you just accept this care, we can move on with our
We
day.
could just move on to the next. Right.
Right, right. Without having to really examine the emotional impact of it. What does it say about me if I allow myself to receive help in the bathroom or for my personal care? What does it say about what's become of my body and my functionality if I allow that to happen?
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't think we make space for that often enough.
No, and these are that's why I love these kind of open and honest conversations like we're having here today, because these are needed. These conversations are needed to have.
Absolutely.
Because people relate to these, because this is real life. And as we're talking about the last week in hospice, the other thing I wanted to mention, if that's okay, I kind of alluded to this. Richard was in control. It was his life. The last good meal he had, I remember it. I know the date. It was February 22nd. It was just a couple of days after my birthday. The reporters were there. They were there as friends. They didn't have all their notebooks and cameras, but he looked at both of them and said, "You're going to have quite the ending to your story." And we all kind of looked at him like, "What's he?" Well, fast forward to March 9th, 2014. That's the 7th. That's our 7th day in hospice. And he hadn't really done much moving for a couple of days. I walked over to the bed and I said, Diane and Carlene are here. They're not here with any, they don't have they're just here as friends. They don't have their reporter, they're just here to be with us. We're going to sit at the table. Well, went and sat at the table, and within 10 minutes, he turns his head, looks at me, shakes his head a couple of times, he signaled me to come over to the bed. And I put him in my arms, and he died right there. He waited for Carlene and Diane to come. Opera was playing in the background, which he loved. And, we think we have all the answers. But that experience, he taught me so much there that in that moment, that he was in control. It was his life. He was in control. As much as I thought I could fix it, but to hold him when he died, I will be forever grateful that I had that experience.
It's amazing. Life-changing in death.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So you have created some incredible meaning out of your caregiving experience, and I want to talk about that. So let's shift gears a little bit.
Okay.
So you are the facilitator, director, owner, CEO of the Whole Care Network.
Yes.
So tell my listeners about that and how it came about.
Well, the Whole Care Network is kind of an extension of my caregiving experience. I was fortunate when I was in the middle of when this all started in 2011. I was looking for resources. Where do I find, what am I doing? And I connected with a couple of really nice online communities that helped me through the process. People that I'm still connected with today. And as Richard made his life transition and wanting to kind of continue in giving back to the caregiving community, because, I'm no longer a caregiver. My care partner, my loved one, has since passed on. I've got all this experience that I'd like to share, but I also know people are going to be coming and doing this after me. So for me, that's when podcasting just kind of started. And I thought it might be great to give people an opportunity to share their story through podcasting. And that's why, this theme of the Whole Care Network, it kind of goes back to my first job at St. Louis and Catholic Charities as a director of an information and referral service hotline, trying to find trusted resources through story sharing. And that's been the premise of the Whole Care Network since I started it in 2017, and I started it really as a hobby, as a way to kind of give back. And at the same time, I finished another master's degree in leadership and communication, did a thesis on caregiving and workplace issues. And I just kind of continue to, sputter along with it and provide people space. And over the last year or so, I recognized there's 300,000 downloads of all of our podcasts on the network. So we're doing something right.
Absolutely.
And again, it's all authentic stories from people like you and me, people that have been in the trenches. There's some folks, they haven't podcasted in a couple of years. Their stories are still up. Some people are, they're into their 200th episode. Well, that's great, but it's a platform where people can go and find a show host that they like, listen to their podcast, and connect with people through stories. Because I think that's really how people get to know one another. It's through stories.
To me, it sounds like Richard's legacy, the legacy of his time with you, has become this platform for storytelling and story sharing.
Yes.
It's incredible. Yeah.
Very
incredible
much so.
Meaning that you made from that experience.
Well, everything that I've done in this space since we started the original blog together, The Purple Jacket, which is still up as a memorial to him, it was, we coined his nickname, TLO, the little one, because he was a foot shorter than me. Everything that I've done has been in his memory. Because he's always when life transitions, we learn how to deal with grief. Everybody learns how to deal with grief differently. And to me, this was a way of honoring him and always having him in the back of my mind, because I don't know if it's a motto or it's just kind of how I feel. It's because my faith tells me I will see him again. My mind tells me he's forever pain-free. And my heart tells me he's always standing right beside me. And by doing these things, the network and, I'm just trying to provide opportunities for people to share their stories, so that when somebody like myself who gets in the middle of a diagnosis and doesn't know what to do, they can come and listen to some stories. They can connect with somebody. We were fortunate that our story was told in a 2015 Pulitzer Prize nominated story. People ask me, well, how did all that happen? Why is your story so different? So there's nothing different about our story. The only different thing about our story is that it was published. Our story is no different than our neighbors who's in the middle of caregiving. It just was published. And that's when I just think it's so important to be able to give people that space so that they could share their story, because it's cathartic and it's memories of a lifetime.
To me, it sounds like you just found another way to hold Richard close. I love it.
I sure do miss him, even after 9 years.
Yeah.
I sure do miss him.
Chris, tell the listeners how they can find the Whole Care Network and access all the caregiving podcasts and resources you've got there.
Well, thanks, Helen. I just wholecarenetwork.com. You'll see on the front page, on the main page, you'll see a tab for media, and just click on that media tab and you'll see the podcast directory. You'll see all the different podcast hosts and their landing pages. And I think a real famous podcast might be coming to the Whole Care Network here real soon, but we don't want to get ahead of ourselves. But there's a variety of There's a variety of shows that touch on caregiving, Alzheimer's, dementia. There's some books. It's just I think it's a friendly resource. And there's some really great things happening this year with courses and new people involved. And I like to say full speed ahead.
Chris, is there a way or a place to watch the 2015 documentary In Sickness and in Health, A Couple's Final Journey? Can you still watch that?
Yeah, the story is still available online. There's a number of ways that can be accessed. One of the easiest ways is through my bio on the Whole Care Network. If you go to wholecarenetwork.com/Christopher MacLellan, you'll see the story laid out in my bio. Or you can, well, since we're talking hospice, we'll just say you could Google Sun Sentinel LGBT dying couple. It'll pop right up. If you go to YouTube and type in the same Sun Sentinel LGBT dying couple, you'll see the video for us. I'm so fortunate that I have such a wonderful memory of Richard through that story.
That is wonderful.
And then you could also go to another, I don't know if I've told you that this was going on, but you could also go to mygreenfolderfilm.com and you'll see the film project that's in the works on our story. And that will have all the links to the story online. Because actually there was 3 stories altogether. It was 3 featured stories in the video. So there's plenty of ways that you'll actually get to see Richard in those videos too, which is kind of cool. So,
well, I'll put all the links up in the show notes so that listeners can go straight in and connect with the Whole Care Network and watch the film, see you and Richard, learn from your experience and your relationship with him. Chris, thank you so much for taking time to talk with me today. I think your caregiving story resounds with so many people, and I'm so grateful that you're generous enough to share it.
Well, I'm really happy that our paths have crossed, and I feel like I have a new friend.
I love the lessons that Chris has to share. He's continuing to teach and to educate and to tell his story and Richard's story repeatedly. And I think that's given so much meaning to their experience, their relationship. But one of the things that really strikes me about their story is firing their first hospice team. Now, you may think, well, she's a hospice nurse. Why would she think that's a good thing? I don't want anybody to ever have to fire their hospice team. But I'm definitely an advocate for caregivers and patients making that decision. If the hospice care, A, is bad, or B, the team culture is a poor fit for you, yes, fire them. Fire them. There are other agencies out there. There are people that will do it right, and they will do it with compassion and respect. It's okay to fire your hospice agency. You can transfer to another agency, and the agency who is discharging you because you asked to be discharged should cooperate. According to the regulations, there are things they're supposed to do, and helping a patient facilitate a transfer is one of them. Richard did return to another hospice later on, so I'm so glad that one bad experience didn't color their opinion of hospice so badly that they were never going to be able to utilize it. I think that's important, and I think it's a good thing for hospice professionals to remember the impact that those mistakes and those transfers have on our patients and their caregivers. One of the things Chris said was he would rather have no hospice than a hospice that could not meet their needs and do a good job. An insufficient and inept hospice. I would rather have no hospice than an insufficient hospice. I think there's so many messages for hospice professionals and for caregivers here. One of the really important things that Chris said about his role as Richard's caregiver was the need for advocacy, being an advocate, but he was the CEO of Richard's Care, the chief everything officer. The chief everything officer, which is absolutely true. For a lot of people, if your caregiving role evolves very slowly, you take on responsibilities just a little bit at a time, and then more and more as things progress, you don't realize that you become that chief everything officer, picking up pieces one at a time, and then all of a sudden you come to it one day and you realize 50% of my day is involved in caregiving. And then, of course, there are other people who come. Chris was referring to, people that experience a caregiving start from an acute event, an accident, a catastrophic health event, and all of a sudden, boom, you're a caregiver. And that kind of advocacy comes on you very quickly. And the realization, I have to make the decisions. There is nobody else, and there's no time to change anything. So advocacy can be very startling, I think. You can come in unprepared. That's one of the reasons advanced care plan conversations are so important. But being the CEO, the chief everything officer for Richard's Care, he said he realized it was okay to question authority. I think one of Chris's biggest messages, caregivers should feel empowered. They should feel empowered in their caregiving role. And he said the good hospice experience happened because of the love, care, and commitment of the staff. So if you're a hospice professional, or if you're an end-of-life worker, regardless of what your discipline is, what your role is, it's good to remember that. You can help your patients and their families to have a good hospice experience if you provide love, care, and commitment in the services you provide. You can connect with Chris MacLellan and the work he's doing, his bio, the documentary, and the podcasts he's in charge of at thewholecarenetwork.com. Chris says it's a lasting memorial to Richard, and I would say it's a legacy and a way of honoring the caregiving that Chris provided as well. Be sure to catch the next episode of the Heart of Hospice podcast. You can find more episodes on theheartofhospice.com, and don't forget to subscribe on your favorite podcast platform. You can connect with the Heart of Hospice on Facebook and Instagram, and send me your questions or comments by email to helen@theheartofhospice.com. And remember, no matter who you are or where you are in your hospice journey, you are the heart of hospice.